I'm talking to Eugene Horn. We are at the University of Johannesburg at the FADA Gallery. We are discussing his exhibition entitled Manufacture, Distractions and Intersections, which is on display for the month of August. The exhibition can be viewed on appointment with Eugene Horn. Eugene, can you tell me about the journey that led you to this exhibition?
Well, I suppose I should start by saying I've always had an aspiration, or a passion, I should say, for drawing, and especially ballpoint pen drawing. And I always used to do drawings for my sculptures, that which I want to create. And I used to do very detailed drawings, which would then define the forms and the shapes of the sculptured sculptures, yes. And over time, this developed. I also used to go to museums. It was before digital cameras. I used to draw all the artifacts which leads to the inspiration of these artworks. And as time progressed, I sort of developed an understanding of how drawing could be a creative tool in itself. I had problems with doing decoration onto surfaces. And at one point, I did some decoration and it all went horribly wrong. And then I started thinking of how can I do my drawings and project them onto the installations, which led to two works, and one went to Taiwan for the Ceramic Biennale there in 2014. And then all of a sudden, one day, I started hearing about digital printing of transfers. And I sent my drawings. There was a local person who was doing printing of the drawings, and they came back, and I couldn't believe that every little mark that I made was transcribed into transfers. The challenge lay in firing them and the color truth that you would get once they applied to objects. And this really surprised me. I was so excited when the color was amazing, and the ballpoint pen renderings with its luminosity just perfectly transposed into the transfers. So I suppose, that's where it started. For me, it was this passion that I had, because I've always had a passion for drawing and for ceramics. And many people say, well, why aren't you making the forms, But for me, that fact that the actual thing that I spent as much time on to make the sculptures, which were never exhibited, and they were fading because they were in ballpoint pen, and to have them now immortalized on the ceramic product itself in such a majestic, and I could go small with the scale, and I could increase the scale, and the detail and the truth to color would always be there, was such a wonderful experience for me. It was just the beginning of another whole journey.
Yes. And in terms of your themes that you used for the exhibition?
Well, I've always had this struggle, from a very early stage. My ceramics, I was exposed to ceramics, and ceramics is so entrenched in craft and tradition. Even though I graduated and I did very well in ceramics, I always had this battle with galleries who saw my work as craft, and craftspeople saw it as art, and there's always an issue with my work, and printing and ceramic digital printing really sits on the cusp of things. People see transfers as production wear. So, to answer your question in that way, it presented those kind of issues. Did I answer your question? Sorry.
Yes.
So for me, that was, the real challenge, really, I suppose.
Okay. One of the things that I find interesting in your exhibition is that you have a very deep love almost for the broken and the restored.
Yes.
Most potters will do anything to avoid having a broken piece on an exhibition, and yet you smash them on purpose and then have them restored. Why are you so attracted to that, and in particular the kintsugi restoration style?
I was always looking for a form and a shape to put the transfers on, so it doesn't just become illustration, that there's an intrinsic link between the body and the drawing. And I started off thinking how can I actually make the drawing work on the surface? And I started with the shards actually, and placing the transfers onto a shard. I made a porcelain, I made a prototype, then made a mold, and then made a porcelain piece, which I press molded. And the shrinkage and the issues around that was just too complex for me to deal with. To make the drawings is very time consuming. To spend time then on the form, plus the composition of the transfer, expands the transitional time to get to an end result. So when I made the earthenware transfers on the shards, which is on display at the exhibition, there was a huge opportunity there for me, but they could only be made in earthenware because of the shrinkage and because of the tension in the body, and it just didn't work. So, and I've always been interested in the shard as the manifestation of that journey from east to west, and the traveling aspect and the interconnectedness of this place and that place to deal with the iconography that I was working with. Yes. So in many ways, it then automatically led to the vases, which I then thought I had to smash, because then they become shards in their own right. And that journey then progressed, where eventually the shard then also gets cut into the transfer, so I didn't have to break the piece. But I mean, let's talk about that as we go along, I suppose.
Okay. The technical side of your work is discussed in depth in the catalogue, which is great. But would you briefly explain the creative process of the transfers then?
Yes, so I would start off with a concept. I read books. The evocative word and the narratives behind that often have themes that are current, relevant, and appropriate. I always believe in those things. That's where the art side and the craft side comes in terms of the early questions you asked me. So to find that position, where does the work sit? My journey began actually with the transfer and imitating the blue and white. And I looked at the swallow, the barn swallow that travels from Europe to South Africa and find a resting place, and I admired and integrated into the landscape and cherished for their beauty and whatever. Yet when human beings come into the space, and we, in this climate of migration and refugees seeking economic freedom, and there are huge other challenges that the human race don't wish upon others, to give them that equal opportunity. So it started with that, and the blue and white gave me that opportunity to explore compositions and techniques where I cut out the individual transfers. That's the aspect that I work with in all my work that's here. I don't create compositions on computers and then transfer them to the vases or the ready-mades. I get the transfers in individual sheets where all the animals or figures are separately in their spaces to maximize the use of the volume on the particular sheet. Then I cut them out individually, put them into lukewarm water, and then they get applied to the actual ceramics. And the compositions are all intuitive. I don't sit beforehand, do a drawing. I suppose being an artist in the 80s and have always been working, one develops a kind of capacity to kind of visualize things, and then you grow through each composition that you explore. So the blue and white range were very traditional, and there were no shards in them. That was actually playing with compositions, looking at traditional blue and white. But then when I transferred them into the fragmented transfer where I could then simulate those cracks, I would cut out tracing paper in the beginning to work out the forms and the shapes, then cut the transfers on the tracing paper, put them into the water for the one section, the intersections of the different types of compositions. And then I would place them on the vase and even cut with an intic cutter, and then scrape away the transfer that I don't want there to make way for the next layer of transfer, which is of another theme altogether. So that creates that juxtapositioning. But the more you work with things, the more comfortable you get with the process. So eventually I could just think it, visualize it, and not have to use the transfer, the tracing paper, to cut it. I could just actually paste it, then work out how do I deal with this. I created spaces, and then I would think how would I handle that composition on that particular vase. The section that's really gives name to the whole exhibition, the series associated with that, which is very baroque. You have no place for your eye to rest. The compositions are juxtaposed, and it's very complex, and it's often looks messy, and it looks a little bit, you can't rest when you look at it. So as I progressed, I tried to use the white space for your eye to rest, which is a baroque kind of device, which gave way for more complex compositions, and then more simplified areas where you have one motif or one element sitting on the vase.
Okay. So from here, what is next?
Well, what I would really like to explore is to go back to the shard. The shards that I created and on display at the exhibitions are earthenware shards. And when you apply these high-fired transfers onto the shards, you get spit out, where the gases actually progress through the transfer, and then you have to touch up on the areas where there are white spots. These forms are all ready-made, which were a challenge in themselves, just dealing with the compositions. But my vision is to take a platter. There's one platter here already on display, where one of the drawings, or the drawings, the composition in the vicissitude series are transpired onto the platter. But I'd like to increase that scale and make them really big, 780 millimeters, if I can, increase the thickness. And then you could either display the entire platter as a piece with all its fragmented sections, where the transfers are it's almost as if one of the vases are now looming large, in a way. And you could exhibit them as separate pieces on coffee tables, or as a centerpiece. And they will then take me back to my great wish to work with those kind of fragments which are precious. And also, the world is very fragmented at the moment, and we live in a fragmented society in the way we deal with our politics and our lives. So I'm hoping that presents all kinds of challenges. I'm also going to work with Wits. I'm going to produce an artist's book, which would then relate to the shards in some kind of way. So I've already sat down with Rosalind Cleaver at the WAM to kind of work out a process for the next two years. But there's also an opportunity to go to China for my sabbatical, where I would then really physically look at a company that could make the shards for me. And I mean, then there's a whole new challenge. Do you increase the scale of the transfer because you've increased the scale of the shard? Or do you fragment it further? So at this point, that's the concept. I've read about 4 books looking at the world we live in, where people are sort of isolated. It's always been a dream of mine. There's this book by Haussmann, Against Nature, where he withdraws to the countryside. He comes out only at night, and he appreciates the symbolist work, but then he looks inward. That's why I like the symbolist work, because and we do that through computers. We get lost in the virtual world, and I'm hoping those kind of different worlds will present opportunities for me to draw and then transpire it onto the transfers, onto the shards.
Great, thank you.
Sure, thank you.